All right, thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz, welcome to the program. And my guest is Steven Slate. He's a trauma analyst, head of research and development at the Baldwin Research Institute. He's the lead author of the Freedom Model for Addictions: Escape the Treatment and Recovery Trap. Steven, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
Well, first of all, right off the bat, I want to talk about the potential effects of the lockdown with the pandemic. We're all getting used to staying inside, being afraid to go out. Some people are more fearful than others. Others have gone on with their life, but no one wants to catch this terrible disease. And we're there's a lot of kind of hoopla around the use of the mask. But I want to talk about what's going on in terms of the psychological effects that this is having, particularly on younger people.
Yeah, well, it's torture. It's torture for people. I mean, flat out,
Yeah.
that's what it is. There was a woman named Molly Jong Fast who wrote an article for The New Yorker not too long ago. And she talked about how she'd been in for 6 months. She covered some political event. I think it was a Trump rally where one person was diagnosed with COVID, and then she had to quarantine herself, but she just went way overboard and hadn't gone anywhere, hadn't left her apartment in 6 months. And she talked about how it's a superpower that she learned from AA, which is to just endure the torture one day at a time of not leaving her home, of not having any social contact. And she just described it as a living hell. And so, I mean, that's a matter of perception. I spent, several months basically isolated. It's not that I never left my place, but there was nothing to do, nowhere to go. And I was feeling pretty cooped up, and it was rough on me. One thing that we know is that people are using drugs and alcohol more, and that's my area of specialty. And in some places, it's very high. And one of the metrics to measure that is overdoses, unfortunately. In Maine, they're up 27% over the same time last year during this pandemic. Nationwide, overdoses are up 16% at least, and that's the low estimate. None of this is going to be fully known until about a year from now because of the way that they process and code these deaths and visits to hospitals. And in Oregon, and I thought this one was very interesting, the overdoses are up 70% over the same time last year. 70%. It's ridiculous. And I think when people, it's almost like the more free time on your hands and nothing to do, no options of what to do, you turn to things that are probably going to hurt you. So I just think that that being cooped up like this is bad for people. I mean, there's no other way to say it than that.
And there seems to be obviously a corollary between the increase in addictions and addictive, behavior, and the virus and the being locked in. And there also seems to be somewhat of a political corollary that I've noticed a trend in that maybe more conservative people are not as cooped up as and not as fearful. They don't look at the mask as being this almost religious item. They go out, they'll put a mask on if they see people getting close by, if they're in a crowd, but they'll still go out. They'll even go to restaurants, except they might sit outside at a table. They'll go to the supermarket. You're not doing everything you do in normal times, but people are getting on with their life, whereas maybe people who are more liberal, and I don't mean to generalize here, but you have to, they're more sheltered, they're more fearful, they're more locked in. They are, they won't go out at all, or they'll go out with all this anxiety. And I mean, like the states that you mentioned where there is an increase, I would bet that it's probably more liberal people. But putting all of that aside, the fact is that it's unhealthy to just stay inside, physically unhealthy. You're not getting enough sunshine. You're not getting. I mean, I go out. I try to go on a hike every day and sit under the sun and let the sun run on against my skin. I mean, you have to. It's if you're going to get ill if you just stay in all the time, and you're going to get fat. Not to mention if you're like me.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. You do need to get out. You need to get movement. I remember at the beginning of this, I barely left the house for, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks, except to run down to Walmart and buy some food, something like that. And I remember the first time I got out and just took a walk down the street about 3/4 of a mile and then back. So I got about 1.5 mile walk down to this cow farm down there. And on a little hilly terrain, I felt better than I had in the previous, month or so.
And it doesn't sound like you even live in an urban area either.
Yeah, well, I was living here at our retreat where I help people with drug and alcohol problems. Normally I live in Queens, New York.
Okay.
But we got out of there and just came up and lived in this. And so, yeah, I was in a rural area and I am now. So there's a hormone called cortisol that is released in your system when you're in fight or flight mode. And I had a psychiatrist point this out to me when we were discussing addiction and how people with it live under fear. And she said that living under fear constantly is bad for anybody because it's constantly releasing this fight or flight hormone. And that gets your body ready to act. And it puts people in a heightened state.
Yes.
And that's good for us when we need it. And it's bad for us when we don't need it and we're just constantly living in it. And I think a lot of people have been tricked into fearing this virus more than is essential. I think if I was elderly and had asthma and a heart condition, you can bet I would have the super mask on and I would only go where it's essential through the beginning period of this. And maybe at this point, I don't know, who knows, right?
Sure.
But I know a lot of young people. I'm 44. I consider that young. I don't know if it is or not, but I have a lot of friends in their 30s that are perfectly healthy, that are entirely freaked out and don't go anywhere. I went on a trip with a bunch of friends, about 10 of us, and most of them wanted everybody to get a coronavirus test before going. And the average age in this group, I think, is about 37 or something like that. And so we all had to get coronavirus tests before we went to stay in this house together. They're really freaked out. And, obviously this has been, everything it sort of seems to become a binary now where, they kind of think either coronavirus is the plague that's going to end humanity, or you're a total denier of it. It doesn't even exist. And they kind of our politics have gotten it so that people can't conceive of.
No, it has become very polarized. You get people who, the big story in the news is whether or not somebody at a Trump rally was seen wearing a mask. That's like shocking that somebody wasn't. as if
Yeah.
this is, but if it's another kind of rally, of course, like a women's march, that's not a problem. But putting that aside, most people, I think, can put aside some of the panic. I would suggest propaganda. That's my opinion that you hear in the nightly news, and put the thing into perspective. You take precautions.
Mhm.
You wash your hands. You
Yeah.
put the mask on if you're coming near people, maybe. You walk a little bit away from them. But beyond that, I mean, you
Well,
know, we have to get on with our lives. And I think that this idea, especially for young people, this idea of a lockdown is creating a situation where people are used to such an authoritarian approach to life. I
yeah.
mean, there are political manifestations to this that are not wholesome and not good.
No, it's not good. It just kind of shut up and do what we tell you. We are following the science, and if you say, well, the science is saying or showing that people in my age group aren't really at risk, so can I go back to work? That's
You
that's
mentioned
right.
something. If I could just interject here, because when you say anything that's to people who are that frightened,
Yeah,
and that on that side politically, if you bring up any good news, they have a meltdown over it. They don't want to hear it. I mean, the CDC has come out with statistics now which show that anybody under 80, the likelihood of them dying from this thing is less than 1%,
yeah,
and then it goes up to maybe 3 or 4%. You're more likely to get in a car accident and die than die from this disease. Now, I'm not saying it's a good thing to get the disease. I
yeah.
mean, I'm protecting myself and I'm older. So, but if you mentioned, I mean, the other day there was a study done which showed that mouthwash kills like a big percentage of it before it goes down into your throat.
Oh wow.
People are annoyed at that. You don't talk about, where did you get this?
Yeah. It
They don't
it
want to hear it. They don't want to hear anything good.
I know, and people talk about um, infection case counts as if they're death counts, as if they're death tolls, and
Well,
it's
that's
really
not
a
good.
bizarre time we're in. My suspicion is we come back to a little bit of reality and sanity next Wednesday.
Next
Uh,
Wednesday, I think it's gonna, yeah,
so
it's gonna be. It'll start to be over by then. Whoever
yeah,
wins,
we're reaching
regardless of who
herd
wins,
immunity, right?
all of a sudden, regardless of who wins. By the way, I mean
I
it's
know.
just
Well, yeah, yeah,
because it will no longer have a political. It will no longer be a political football at that point.
exactly. That's exactly how I feel about it.
So you're an expert on addiction.
Yeah,
You uh, you note that addiction is not a disease, which is of course a little bit contrary to conventional thinking on this. We always hear, oh, alcoholism and drug addiction, that's a disease. Like you're not responsible for it. You're born that way. It's
yeah,
something that is overtaking you. And to suggest otherwise is being judgmental, and you're saying someone is a bad person because they're doing it, which I don't think anyone is. We're all vulnerable to these things. It's not a good or bad. It's a problem. But so talk a little bit about what it is, the addiction,
yeah.
in your opinion.
In my opinion, you know, people begin to look at a drug as if it is the only thing that can make them feel good. And it's not necessarily like that from the beginning. At the beginning, it's just something that provides a little bit of fun, you know? But there's a lot of romanticized ideas about drugs and their value and what
Mm,
they're going to do for us out there. In other words, if you just look at alcohol alone, people say it brings them euphoria and that it numbs their emotions. And to me, I there's a contradiction in that. Euphoria and numbness are kind of total opposites, right?
yeah, of course.
And they say it makes people agitated and angry, but they also say that it makes people calm and loving and more sociable. Again, these are opposites, but now we've already generated a long list of the powers of alcohol. Some people think it makes you creative. it relieves depression, anxiety, stress, trauma, go down the list. People think that it's a cure-all, and quite literally a snake oil. Like if you've ever seen The Wizard of Oz, and I think there's a snake oil salesman scene where he's selling this tonic that does anything and everything, cures all your ills.
Right.
That's eventually how a person who develops an alcohol problem looks at alcohol. They think it's got all these magical powers, right? And at the same time, they think one of the problems is that we're very obsessed with pharmacology, with chemicals. We think that they can do anything and everything for us. That is a side effect. I mean, that's been going on for a long time. But what really bolstered that sensibility in our culture is the 1980s and 90s with the big push for antidepressants and the idea that these were going to cure our moods. If you have a problem with your mood, it's just that you're missing a neurotransmitter. So, right, people look to alcohol, heroin, cocaine, all of these things in the same way. I mean, if you notice, when we started allowing medical marijuana, the list of conditions people would say they needed marijuana to treat were similarly psychological, that I need it for my anxiety and such. And we just go right down the list. And there's good evidence that marijuana can help with seizures, and it can help with appetite, loss of appetite, different things. But for all of this psychological stuff, all of our bad feelings, there's not really any good evidence on that. And people have experiences with marijuana that are all over the map. A lot of times you might feel calm when you smoke it, and then you might feel paranoid another time when you smoke it. And likewise with alcohol, a guy might forget all of his troubles one night, and then the next night he drinks and he's crying in his beer about what's bothering him. But nevertheless, the idea persists that these are magical and they can serve all your purposes. And that's the bind that a person with a drug or alcohol problem is in. It's not that their brain is warped. It's that in their mind, they've got some really romanticized, fantastical beliefs about the value of the drug. And then that also plays against the fact that they don't think they have other options to relieve their stress, to enjoy themselves, to be social. So it's really a matter of personal perspective. Do you want me to comment on the evidence of the disease model?
Yeah, but let me just comment briefly here. I mean, it seems like it's both an internal and an external con job in a way. We're talking about psychological situations which can cause stress and depression, rightfully, because things can be depressing sometimes, or anxiety. Yeah, that's part of life. These are normal, natural things for any person to experience from time to time. And, sometimes it can be extreme depending on the situation. But if you're taking a look at this substance outside of you and looking at it, as you say, there's some kind of a magic potion. You become, externally, it's being marketed that way. It's being promoted that way in our culture. It's being held up as glamorous. The Beatles glamorized taking drugs, right? In the 60s. As much as I love the Beatles, I mean, they did make, right? I mean, they made it look fun, and they made it look cool and glamorous.
Yeah.
And so we buy into that. We buy into the culture of it, and we buy into the marketing of it. And then internally, we want to have some easy solution if we're dealing with troubles. Everyone has troubles. If something is going on that's depressing or angering or anxiety producing, it's a lot easier to go out and take a pill or to take a drink than it is to kind of, sit with yourself and ask yourself about it and learn about it and cope with the problem and look for a purpose. So, it does appeal to the side of us, and we all have that side, that is looking for an easy way out and is looking to conform to a popular cultural phenomena.
Yeah, you're absolutely on the money with that. That's what it is. We're looking for a quick fix. The problem is it doesn't really work, but people keep chasing it. So they'll increase the amount of alcohol that they use, or they'll try to find a stronger drug. And Andrew Weil, have you heard of him, the nutritionist?
I think so.
Dr. Andrew Weil. He was also a pioneering researcher on drugs. He got the first study on marijuana authorized by the DEA, and they gave him pot to use back in the late 60s at Harvard. And he tested marijuana on people who knew nothing about marijuana. Right? They had no preconceptions. They had no history with it. They didn't really know anything about it. So that was who he wanted to find, to see, are there any consistent effects of marijuana? And when he did that, there wasn't. People didn't necessarily perceive it as a high. They didn't necessarily perceive it as stress relieving. There was no consistent effect because there were no expectations. And the conclusion he came to is that most drugs that we use for highs are active placebos, meaning they do something to us. You can't deny that, right? We know that the THC does fire the brain in some patterns it doesn't normally fire. But then we make of that what we will, and that comes from the expectancies that we come into it with. And so, yeah, it's a fruitless quest to try to keep creating an internal, we're looking to something external, a drug, to create an internal state. And really, there's a problem, one problem with that, if you can imagine, you've got a brain here, and when you have an emotion, the brain, what neuroscience is now showing us is that your brain activates in patterns where it's pulling from a memory over here. It's pulling some hormones out over here. It's processing your, it's creating a prediction of what you're going through and what the outcome is going to be by pulling from all these different parts of the brain are active when you have, like, let's say, anxiety. Now, if you take an anti-anxiety drug like Xanax or Valium, it is a targeted drug, and it hits some of those neurons, only the ones that respond to it, which might be a little slice of the whole pie of the brain that's being used to create the experience of anxiety. And so the drug can never really create that entire brain pattern that feels like anxiety. But really, so then what is happening is we feel an effect of a drug, we feel a high, and we're focused on that high and for a moment instead of our problems. And that's why anxiety seems to go down. But the more the problem sticks with us, we're perfectly capable of focusing on a problem while being high. And one of the ways that I try to explain that to the people that I'm helping is it's like walking and chewing gum at the same time. There was a point when you were a child where if you're going to chew gum, you had to sit still and focus on chewing it the right way, or you'd swallow it, you'd do something wrong. At a certain point, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. And after a certain level of experience with drugs, they're no longer so distracting to you. So you can be high and think about your problems at the same time. And it's funny, people call my organization for help all the time. And they'll call often in a state of drunkenness or influence of some other drug. And they'll be crying. They'll be so upset. And they also tell us that they take the drug to deal with their negative emotions. It's like, well, you're intoxicated right now and you're going through all the negative emotions, so it clearly isn't working. Sorry, I'm going deep on that, but that is the issue, and that's what people need to resolve. They're trying to get something out of the drug that you can't quite get.
Not at all. I mean, it's I mean, look, there might be in certain situations a I don't know how to put this, maybe a reasonable purpose for getting high. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not like a teetotaler in that way, and I think that you can create, you can become more creative in a certain way if you're a musician, if you're an artist, or if you're a writer. You get insight in certain ways. It does have an effect on altering the consciousness, and
yeah.
if it's done right, and if it's done appropriately, and if it's done for good reasons, um, I'm not here to say it's a good idea, but I understand it.
Well,
Um,
I understand it too. I mean, that was part of Andrew Weil's point, is certainly taking any of these drugs a little bit can be exactly what you said, because it is altering your consciousness slightly in
right,
some way. And it's a word, and he's, from what he said about it, he's positive about the experience. He thinks it's an experience people should have. But it's
right.
not an experience you should rely on constantly for the wrong things, like you
Well,
said.
well, that's what, in a sense. I mean, and I'm not here to say you should.
Yeah.
I don't want to be on the record with that one. I mean, that's personal. But
Yeah.
look. I mean, like anything else, if it's done for a very specific purpose at a very specific time in very moderate way, not as a habit, not as something where you drink. It's like, I remember Keith Richards once gave an interview where he said that taking the drugs was like having one coffee in the morning.
Yeah.
You just he developed a certain affinity. Of course, I don't think he has in probably 20 years, even in spite of what you might think about him.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
I've seen that
yeah,
recently. He has been
he's
like
been
totally
completely
sober.
sober. But the thing is that it becomes a habit, and it has very serious negative physical, psychological um, consequences to a person
Sure.
if it becomes that, because if you're not using it properly, in like very rarely, and just even then, again, I'm not saying you should. So the problem is that it becomes a thing where people just they do it all the time, and they forget why they're doing it. It becomes more of a social experience.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Anyways, so but we have to be careful because of a rise in anxiety due to the virus, due to a lot of things. And it does open us up to be more vulnerable to looking for an easy solution to these things. Doesn't mean you're a bad person. Everybody looks for that. That's part of it's part of being alive.
Yeah, I'm so with you on that. And that's one of the points we're constantly trying to persuade people to understand, is that you're not odd for having anxiety and depression, even
Right, it's
trauma.
normal. Of
It's
course.
normal.
Of course it
And
is.
and but there's a problem when people go for help with this, and at this point the addiction treatment industry convinces them, if you do become too anxious, you'll use, you better run and get treatment, you better
As if you have
run,
no control over the matter.
as if it's a one, exactly, as if it's cause effect, simple cause effect. And what I try to teach them is no, between some bad event, and if I was to go use heroin, which I'm not gonna, because I don't make the connection anymore, but between that bad event and say you're going to use heroin, is the idea that using heroin is a good response to this, and that'll help. So if you can break yourself of that belief, then you can go through a lot of stress, and that's why, um, you know, I can say at the same time that the lockdown has led us to more overdoses and more drug and alcohol use, but it hasn't made everybody overdose. It hasn't made everyone use more drugs and alcohol. And that's because not everyone conceives of drug or alcohol use as a good response to this. And so that's what I try to persuade the person with the problem to do, is to stop conceiving of it that way. But what they're taught in rehab is kind of, you're an automaton. If somebody offers you a drink, it's going to be hard or impossible for you to resist taking that drink. if you get stressed out, or if someone dies who's close to you, that's going to trigger you. And they use this word trigger.
The trigger, yeah, as if there's something that external that happens that controls you, and it has nothing to do with conscious choice. And
Exactly.
if you're thinking about doing something, you are feeling anxious or depressed or just whatever, that might lead you to think, oh, maybe I should do some substance. If you just for a minute look within and reason with yourself, because you're engaging in a massive act of personal deception by thinking that, and you're
Yeah,
rationalizing to a very high degree. We all rationalize sometimes to be able to do different things. I mean, you
absolutely.
rationalize to get in a car because you might, it's dangerous. So you kind of suspend certain things to get from point A to point B,
Yeah.
but you have to realize that that's what's going on with this. You are rationalizing. And if you look within and think about it, you might think otherwise.
I think you have a deep understanding of this already.
Okay. So, Stephen, let my listeners and viewers know where they can get information about you and your work and your book and everything else.
So we have a website called thefreedommodel.org, freedommodel.org. And that explains the services that we offer. The book is available on there. It's also available on Amazon, on Google Play, on barnesandnobles.com. You can get it in all those places. It comes in paperback or an ebook. And it's a deep book. It's about 450 pages, and it is self-help. It's not a general interest. You're going to fly through it and get an overview on addiction.
Right.
It's really designed to help the person move past the myths of the addiction treatment industry about disease and loss of control, and understand that you are in control, and then to focus on the decision-making process and what that means. And I know you didn't want a full explanation of this, so I guess one thing
Please.
is that the most important thing is that you frame your change. If you're going to quit a drug or alcohol habit, and you can quit by moderating as well, like put down that dangerous drug and have a less dangerous one once in a while, whatever it is for you. Okay. We allow for all of that in our program, because that is what occurs in real life. If you look at the data, more than half of former alcoholics are now moderate drinkers. So that's a possibility for people. But you take this change that you want to make, and you have to find a way to frame it as a pursuit of happiness, not something you have to do to avoid death. Because some people sit there for decades telling themselves, I have to quit because my wife is going to leave me, or I'm going to develop cirrhosis, and they keep on drinking, right? They keep on, and the scaring yourself straight, that only works for a little while, but what really needs to happen is you need to be able to frame this choice to change as a pursuit of happiness. And you have to convince yourself you're going to be happier quitting or cutting back than you were relying on this drug the way you were. So that ends up being the thrust of the Freedom Model for Addictions. So again, you can go to thefreedommodel.org and learn about all our services, which are, we have the book. We teach people over Zoom like this, the program. And I mean, that's a big jump in price between those two. And then we have a retreat where people can come and stay for 3 to 4 weeks and learn it all here, isolate away from substances for a while to get their head in order and to wrap their mind around this problem. So those are the things that we offer. And we're a non-disease program. We're non-12-step, and we don't set people up for a life of ongoing treatment and meetings. We try to show them how to just embrace this as a choice. And once you're happy about making the choice to change, there's no support needed. It's like when I was using tons of heroin every day and I knew that's what I wanted, I didn't need a cheering squad or to make me go get my heroin, you know?
Right,
And it's
exactly.
the same thing when you get over it and you know that you're happier not doing that no more, there ends up being no support needed at that point. So we're really looking at
It's very much
completely,
you're into control of yourself at that point.
yeah,
And
yeah.
good. Oh, and also I think it's a great thing you're doing these Zoom meetings. I mean, it's incredible technology.
It
That's
is,
great.
and we've been doing that since 2011.
Oh, okay.
We've been
Excellent.
doing it over Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, any of
Mhm.
it, whatever works for people. Because you know, something people need to know is that 90% of people get over their drinking problems eventually, and only about 20% of them ever get any formal help. And the same is true with all other drugs, though for other drugs, the rate of recovery is even higher. It's over 95% for all other drugs. So, and again, few people get treatment. The only drug with which about half of people eventually get treatment is heroin and the other opioids. But with most drugs, very few people get treatment, but most people get over it. So this shows, and if you compare the rates between treated and untreated, the treated people don't fare any better. Now, I'm not saying don't ever get help, but what I want to say is that everybody who quits is really doing that on their own power. And there's nothing that says you need to be in a rehab to quit. If it's where you're comfortable, then you do that. But people can pick up a book and learn. And I get letters from people that do it with our book all the time. And they say, this changed my life.
Oh, that's amazing. And you're certainly running, we didn't get into this, but you're certainly running contrary to a multi-billion-dollar industry that
Yes.
probably is not that happy with what you're saying here. Anyway, I don't want to go,
No, they're not. They don't
go
like
too far into that. But Steven Slate, I want to thank you for joining me, Steven. But we'll do it again.
Thanks, Charles. It was my pleasure.